Now, who doesn't know Nintendo? I have to admit, I do have a soft spot for Nintendo. Always been a gamer that plays on every system that has games, but I don't know, Nintendo, they always had something special. Like you probably know, Nintendo was quite successful in their early console days. The NES sold like none other, and they did manage to continue that success with the SNES. But in the early 90s, the fifth console generation was starting. Bye-bye 16-bit era and hello 32 and 64-bit era. But as time goes by, the world was changing, and so did technology. Sega and the new player Sony opted for the new storage media, the CD format. Even the non-successful consoles tried mostly to use the new disc format to put the game's data on it. But wait, maybe I might be going a bit too fast. It was the year of 1993, the start of the fifth console generation. It was the company Fujitsu that started the fifth generation with the launch of the oldly named FM Town Smarty. This was world's first 32-bit console, but never gotten a release outside of Japan. Basically, this was a console version of the infamous home computer, the FM Towns. What stood out most in the fifth generation of video games is that we saw the explosion of 3D polygon graphics and the compact discs, and the rise of Sony as a video game console developer. It was also the last generation to see such a large amount of competition. The fifth generation is where CD-ROM started to become the norm as a form of video games media. It was unclear at the beginning if Nintendo would follow, since they did experiment with that idea years before with the SNES. They even asked Sony to help them make it. But later on, they refused to continue to work on the Project PlayStation, the actual name for the add-on. So basically, Nintendo was actually the reason why PlayStation even started life. In the beginning, there were plans for a SNES slot to be included in the PSX system. But since Nintendo asked for all the revenue on the SNES games sold for Sony, well, they kinda declined that idea and cancelled it. The Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation were probably the biggest players during 1994. They both used the optical disc format. Even other consoles like the 3DO, Neo Geo CD, Amiga CD32 all used CD-ROM readers. Back at Nintendo's annual Sonshinkai trade show of August of 1993, President of Nintendo Hiroshi Yamauchi already announced the existence of Project Reality, the successor to Nintendo's widely popular Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It was going to be built in partnership with Silicon Graphics to bring high-quality 3D graphics to the masses for under $300. The partnership with SGI was exciting since the company was responsible for CGI in many high-grossing blockbusters like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. Heck, in Jurassic Park, they even showed the SGI computer. Project Reality was announced to be released in the summer of 1995 for a price of exactly $250. It was still unclear what Nintendo would do since no additional information regarding Project Reality would be shown until the winter of CES of January 1994 in Las Vegas. The only thing that we did know was that the graphics looked really amazing. They showed us tech demos representing the power of the upcoming consoles. In one demo, a shark was shown swimming in water, highlighting the effects the new console would be capable of, all in real time. The second demo were skylines of different cities being rendered to Project Reality specs. These demos helped showcase just how powerful this upcoming console would be compared to the other consoles. And after the CES, a hype behind the Project Reality was at an all-time high. Unfortunately, things behind the scenes at Silicon Graphics began to fall apart, with many executive level problems. Nintendo began to distance themselves a bit from the company, even though they were originally responsible for their early hype. In May of 1994, Nintendo made the unusual move of opting for cartridges. Some rumors suggest they did that to prevent piracy and allowed Nintendo to have more control over what was sold on the system. It would also mean the system would cost $100 less to produce without an optical disc reader. The use of cartridges brought more negative than positive results. Positive was the loading times were considerably longer on discs, and they are more prone to be damaged. But negative ones are that cartridges have less waste storage space compared to the discs and are more expensive to manufacture. Therefore, the now-known N64 could not make use of CD audio but had to stick to the restricted sound chips. Summer SES in Chicago of 1994 was Nintendo's chance also to prove the tech inside of their upcoming machine, Project Reality. Now it was renamed to the Nintendo Ultra 64, available to play where the arcade versions were Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA, but the real surprise must have been when Nintendo revealed the first images of Donkey Kong Country. Brother Tim and Chris Stampers, the founders of WareWare, did invest in an SGI workstation to produce that game. Not only was this game developed using the SGI tech that was going to power the Ultra 64, it was going to be released on the Super Nintendo. They were also responsible for the impressive Killer Instinct. It was the arcade giant Williams that would distribute these into the arcades under the Midway label. Cruis'n USA was a game that they made for the system under this deal. Coming back to the decision of choosing cartridges over disk drive, well, it brought one major fallback for Nintendo, and it was one they really did not anticipate. Capcom, Konami and Square were really persistent during the NES and SNES era for real quality titles. But the decision for going for cartridges made them vastly reduced presence on Nintendo's N64. Nintendo would spend the majority of 1995 revealing nothing about the Ultra 64. Even with the first Electronic Entertainment Expo on the horizon, Nintendo announced the machine wouldn't be at the show at all. It was during this same announcement that Nintendo revealed that the Ultra 64 would release in December 1995 in Japan, with the US and European release sometime in 1996. Nintendo watched as the masses bought up the competing consoles, and they could do nothing more than print ads about how the Ultra 64 would be worth the wait. The Ultra 64 made its worldwide debut in final form in November of 1995 at their annual Sonsinkai trade show, also known as Nintendo Space World. Nintendo released the Ultra 64 details and game trailers. The system had once received a name change to simply Nintendo 64. It was also revealed that the system would be delayed until April of 1996 in Japan. Games playable at the show were early prototypes for Super Mario 64 and Kirby Ball 64. Other video demos were available showcasing early concepts like the games of Zelda 64, Star Fox and Mario Kart. The Ultra Nintendo 64 controller was also revealed for the first time. It debuted the analog control stick for 3D gaming, replacing the digital D-pad, which was originally designed with 2D games in the mind. This was mimicked in both Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation in the later years that followed, becoming the standard till this very date. But to further attract any more developers back from Sony and Sega, Nintendo also announced the existence of that would be later known as the 64 disk drive. Unfortunately, the Nintendo 64 didn't release in April of 1996 as planned and was pushed back to an additional 2 months to the June of 1969. Before the system was released in the States, Nintendo already announced a price drop. It went from $250 to $199, bringing the system in line with both the Saturn and PlayStation. And the US release had even the release date been put back a day forward, because July the 30th was school night, and parents complained, so Nintendo used Sunday of the 29th of September to release the new console. The N64 was released with a whopping total of just 2 games. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that right. Just 2 games. Only Pilot Wings 64 and Mario 64 were ready and available. And don't mind the overuse of the number 64, Nintendo used this in quite some titles. A bit like in the days when they added Super before any title on the SNES, like Super Star Wars, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, and many more. But oh boy, those titles really showed us what the N64 was capable of. The graphics were uncanny and the positive reviews from the critics only added to an almost guaranteed success. Reviewers praised the console's advanced 3D graphics and gameplay, while criticizing the lack of games. Without a doubt, Mario 64 and Pilot Wings were gems of games, but well, only 2 games, well, that just ain't a lot, right? There were some games in the work and almost ready, but it would take more than a month before they got in release. Those games were Wave Race 64, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, and Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Luckily, more were in the making for in the near future. But despite the limited number of games, N64 sales continued to climb. With the approaching holiday season, Nintendo would do what seems to be a tradition and warn the public about the shortages about their new system. Despite this, the N64 would go on and sell 1.5 million units in the United States by the end of December. A feature that took SNES 7 months to accomplish. By the end of 1969, Nintendo found themselves in a position where they could once again reign supreme as console leader, with a launch both in Japan and North America that beat Sega and Sony. Nintendo was quickly regaining lost ground. The problem Nintendo would face going into 1997 is that it still had to overcome, well, games? Okay, we talked about the Japanese release, about the American release, but what about Europe? Well, the whole world had gotten the chance to play on the Nintendo 64, but we poor Europeans had to wait a few more months. For us, the golden date was set on March the 1st in 1997. Just like in the States, it sold pretty well and quickly. I had a hard time finding one, and I'm not sure that pre-orders were a thing back then. Anyways, after visiting and calling many stores, I found one. I instantly bought Pilot Wings and Mario 64. It was uncanny, the feeling the first time you saw the N64 in action. No wonder the system sold out worldwide on release, yet with only 2 games available. In Europe, we had more luck. We also got the chance of buying Star Wars Shadow of the Empire, FIFA Soccer 64 and Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. And 3 days later, the fabulous Turok the Dinosaur Hunter also became available. The fun did not stop there, cause many other anticipated games were due for a release somewhere in the near future. Games like Wave Race 64 were really titles that showed the power of the N64. Despite having some great games coming, it never got to the amount of titles like the PSX did. The Nintendo 64 was in heavy demand upon its release. Time called to purchase interest, that rare and glorious middle-class Cabbage Patch Dolls frenzy. The magazine even said that the celebrities, Matthew Perry, Steven Spielberg's office, and some Chicago Bulls players called Nintendo to ask for special treatment to get their hands on the console. Nintendo successfully outsold Sony and Sega early in the 1997 in the US. And by the end of its first full year, 3.6 million units were sold in the United States. Business Wire even reported that Nintendo 64 was responsible for Nintendo sales having increased by 156% by 1997. Even though the N64 had a strong launch, the decision to use cartridge format is said to have contributed to the diminished release pace and higher price of games compared to the competition, and thus Nintendo was unable to maintain their lead in America. The company would continue to outsell Sega Saturn throughout the generation, but would trail behind the PlayStation. In Japan, the console was not successful, failing to outsell the PlayStation and even the Sega Saturn. A developer for Earthbound 64 and friend of Shigeru Miyamoto speculated in 1997 that the Nintendo 64's lower popularity in Japan was due to the lack of role-playing video games. Nintendo reported that the system's hardware and software sales had ceased by 2004, 3 years after the GameCube's launch. On December 31, 2009, the Nintendo 64 had yielded a lifetime total of 5.54 million system units sold in Japan, 20.63 million in America and 6.75 million in other regions, for a total of 32.93 million units sold. The Nintendo 64 remains one of the most recognized video game systems in history, and its games still have impact on the game industry today. Designed in tandem with the controller, Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time are widely considered by critics and publics to be some of the greatest and most influential games of all time. GoldenEye 007 is one of the most influential games for the shooter genre. So all by all, Nintendo 64 didn't do a bad job. Rest in peace, my friend. So that was it, guys and girls. I hope you did enjoy this, because I kinda did. I put a huge amount of work and research into this. If you would like me to continue this work, please leave a like, and if you didn't do already, go subscribe. Now have a nice day. Maybe, I don't know, go do the dishes, make some homework, go wash yourself, go to your grandma, bring her a present. Do a hobby. If you don't have a hobby, maybe whatever you do, keep it safe. Peace. Grifter signing out.